Good morning, everyone. What a great way to start our morning, hearing a highlight from one of our former students. Isn't that great? I'm not sure who is in worse shape here, if it's me for being assigned the very first session of the conference or you for having to endure it. So, welcome nonetheless. And I'm certainly glad to be with you this morning and wanted to take just a couple of minutes to share with you a few updates in CIMC world since you want to see another part of the agenda dedicated to that. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes going through some updates and then we'll get to the POL Administration and Reporting part of the session. So all good talk shows begin with a top 10 list, right? We're going to go ahead and jump into our first session this morning with a top 10 list of things that CTE directors need to know about curriculum and instructional management, summer 2021 version. So number 10, the course management system does have a few updates. And you'll notice in the agenda that there are a few session options available this week to help you learn more about the CMS if you're unfamiliar with it, or to learn more about its updates. But I want to point out just a few things that may be of interest to you this morning. The first is if you've been an NCCT admin or the CMS lately, you've probably noticed that you now have a toggle view to be able to view 2020, 2021, or 2021, 2022 course information. So from the CMS homepage, and remember, this is a separate link. It takes you outside of NCCT admin if you're accessing it through that portal. But from the CMS homepage, you're going to see the 2020, 2021 essential standards and course inventory information. You might be wondering, why are last year's documents still posted here? But the reason for that is that many of you guys are still engaged in summer learning opportunities resulting from House Bill 82. And since that window of instruction, assessment, and data reporting is open through the end of August, you're going to continue to find that the reports and information that you need for that instruction and data reporting in the CMS. So just know that you do have that option to see last year's documents there on that homepage. We can expect last year's documents to go away probably sometime early to mid-September. In the meantime, if you click on the View 2021-2022 Essential Standards and Course Inventory button that you see highlighted here on the screen, it'll be toward the top of the page on the CMS, then you'll be able to queue the same information and reports for this school year. When you navigate to the 2021-2022 view, you'll notice a message warning you that the information posted here is considered draft until September 4th. And we don't expect major changes to the essential standards and course inventory docs, but we do want you to be aware that some changes may occur between now and the beginning of September. So just keep that in mind as you're planning. You'll notice a new report for this year, and that's a Pathways by Program Area Guide. When you click on this link, you'll see a list of CTE pathways organized by cluster, and each pathway is hyperlinked to its respective pathway sequence document. So this is a great addition for you and your CIMCs or CDCs and SPCs as you're planning your CTE programs locally. It's also a great way for students and parents to research pathway sequences by cluster, as many of their career development activities point them to a particular cluster first. So having the pathways organized by cluster provides students and parents just another tool to dig a little bit deeper in their career exploration. It's very easy to toggle back and forth between last year's and this year's documents just by using the View Year button toward the top of the page. Speaking of pathway sequence documents, all of our pathways have gotten an update or a facelift, if you will, to include co-op courses available in the Career Pathway Major Options section. You'll also notice a new section with work-based learning and experiential learning opportunities that are listed for students to consider, as well as a section at the bottom for CTSOs aligned to students' pathways. And then the last CMS update that I wanted to share is the course information and course standards documents or reports have been updated to include additional information that used to be included in our previous course user guides. And so one of the updates that I'd like to point out here is that if the identified proof of learning for a course is a credential, you're now going to see that specific credential listed in the course information document. And that credential will be listed as proof of learning, and then you'll see the specific name of the credential. I think this is particularly helpful as we continue to message our expectations and opportunities to students, parents, support staff in our schools, and even members of our larger community. So that update is there for you as well. All right, number 9, NCCT admin has had a few updates or facelifts, if you will. And so we're going to look at a couple of those new features. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, you've probably noticed future views in the NCCT admin or the CMS site if you've been in the system recently. But if you look in the report section of NCCT admin, you will see a drop-down list of future course information reports. You'll see them highlighted here on the screen. Here you will find the newest course licensure report, course standards, credentials by course, credential costs, equipment guides, the LCO, and the SOCA reports. Again, this information is considered draft status until September 4th. The 21-22 course licensure report, which is accessible under that future course information section we just reviewed, has been updated, and it now includes a new report that I think you guys will find very beneficial as you're either hiring new staff or adding new courses to your programs of study. The course delivery requirements report outlines required and suggested teacher training by course offering. So for example, if we were to run this report or pull this report and look at the different courses that you may want to add to your current programs of study, let's say that we decided to add counseling and mental health to our existing programs. You would note in this document that the youth mental health and first aid training is a required training for a teacher to be able to teach that course. And that would be listed in that document. So I think this has been a great addition to the licensure report this year. Another feature that you may have noticed already is the option to either show or hide the legend on various report screens. So the legend is really the notes section. That's the place where our programmers at TOPS provide information about how to either decode reports or determine which data is included or excluded in those reports. So that note section can get pretty lengthy at times, particularly when there's a lot of information to share about the ins and outs of different reports. So the programmers have decided to add a toggle switch for us to either show or hide that legend or note section so that you can either minimize that section of your screen or either expand out those notes to be able to view what you need to view for those reports. So this feature probably won't affect you very much, but just wanted you to be on the lookout for that legend show button just in case you think that you're missing some pertinent information on the screen when you're pulling up reports in NCCT admin. I think this is probably the best feature, and I saved it for last for NCCT admin new features. I know many of you are going to appreciate this new field that's been added to the LCO report. You're going to see a new field on the far right of the LCO report, and it will list for you which PSUs by number are approved to offer the LCO course that is listed in the report. So this will be a very quick and easy way for you to identify others that are offering the same LCO as you, or to help you find a colleague that's offering an LCO that you might be interested in offering. I know that your RCs are thrilled that this field was added to the LCO report, and I think that you guys will all find it very beneficial as well. So many thanks to our programmers for adding that in for us. Many of the reports in NCCT admin have been enhanced, and some of them have been updated to align better with our current reporting of Perkins indicators. You may recall that the POL proficiency report last year gave us quite a few headaches as we were trying to make sense of the data that was being returned on the report. We had a lot of questions coming in from directors and CIMCs. And the reason for that really just comes down to the fact that the programming had not changed from our previous reporting and the use of credential in lieu of the state assessment. So we were seeing courses with a credential POL show up on the report, and then it was creating lots of confusion because if the student met the credential, they would show up on the report. If they had not met all of the parts of the credential, let's say like in an NCCER course, they met maybe all but one module, then they didn't show up at all, and it was skewing the proficiency numbers for those courses. So we've removed the credential POLs from the report. And now when you run the proficiency report, you're only going to see proficiency calculations resulting from CTE state assessments, PBM, and local POLs. And we've renamed the report the 5S4 proficiency report. And really that's just to help remind us which POL results are reported in our Perkins 5 indicator 5S4. So please remember that courses that are in pilot or field test status, they might appear on those reports if we're collecting that data, but those would not necessarily be used in state or federal reporting. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that if you run the 5S4 proficiency report now for last year's data, the new programming is already applied to those reports. So even though the report is new for us this year, last year's data will report out with this new format. You may have already run some reports from last year and saved those, and it may have had some of those credential POL courses. Many of you guys have had to weed those out as you are preparing data for your school boards. But if you run those reports now, you'll notice that those credential POL courses have been removed. Many of you guys did some analysis of the standards reports that we manually created for you last spring around CTE state assessment data, and you used that data to inform instruction locally. And that's what we wanted you to do. Prior to now, that standards report was only available as a PDF download. And while that report format is aesthetically pleasing, it really doesn't lend itself well to an analysis of that data on a more global scale. So now you're going to see a download CSV option in your standards report screen that will provide for you a usable file format that you can use to analyze your data. Again, another great enhancement to our NCCT admin reports. And as I mentioned earlier, the course licensure report has been updated, and additionally, the credential cost report has been updated to include additional information that was previously missing in those reports. I just wanted to give you that quick update. And then just as a teaser, we do expect a few additional updates coming in NCCT admin this year. Programmers are currently working on a way to provide the course standards report download with some formatting options. This file is what we typically call the course blueprint, and our current download option through the CMS is a CSV file, which, as many of you know, has no formatting options. The programmers are looking for some ways to incorporate the pacing guide calculation like we've had in our old blueprints. I'm not sure when or if this project will be completed anytime soon, because it requires some more complex steps to complete in the programming, but we'll certainly keep you updated as that information unrolls. We can also expect to see the How Things Count document included in our NCCT admin reports at some time in the near future as we continue to make this our one-stop shop for all of our documents related to data collection analysis. So I think that will be helpful as well. And then lastly, more for your CIMCs, but we should be seeing the PBM tab populated in the dashboard for courses that have the POL identified as the PBM. And this will be where your teachers, your BLCs, and even your CIMCs will be reporting student results for PBMs in NCCT admin. Okay, number 8. A new exam browser is now available for NC Test. So TOPS released a new secure exam browser for NC Test late spring or early summer. Information about that new test browser has been posted to both the accountability and CIMC Moodles. And while the old version still works, you don't have to worry about trying to get it installed for any type of summer testing that you still have going on. But did want to let you know that the new version is now available and ready for those who wish to install it. So I would just encourage you to work with your IT and accountability staff locally to determine what your plan will be for installing the new secure exam browser prior to your fall 2021 exam administration. Number 7, our Certiport data continues to feed NCCT admin through the end of August. And just to give you a couple of dates to keep in mind, our most recent Certiport upload was July 13th and included credentials that were earned just leading up to that date. We plan to do another load on August 9th, and the purpose of that load will be to capture any July CDM results that come in through the system during the summer CDM window. And so that August 9th load will include credentials that are earned through August 6th. So keep that in mind as you're planning your CDM processes locally this summer. And then we'll do one final load for the 2020-2021 school year on August 30th, and that will capture the remaining summer learning results for any credentials that were earned through the August 27th deadline of administering and reporting credentials in NCCT admin. Number 6, in case you didn't know, concentrator validation is still happening for last year's underclassmen, and it will be due September the 3rd. So Stephen and I are hosting a session on CTE concentrator validation this Wednesday morning, but I do want to just remind you that last year's underclassmen still need to be validated. Some of you may have already worked on that or may have even gone through that process as you did your seniors, but many of you only worked on seniors back in the spring since we were in such a tight time crunch. But as you begin to run and review your reports in Power School in the weeks ahead, I want you to be mindful that last year's underclassmen, grades 9 through 11, have been promoted, and they're now in grades 10 through 12. So as you're running those reports, you're going to be validating those students that are currently showing grades 10 through 12. Of course, you would have some 9th grade students if they repeated 9th grade this past year. You're going to be validating concentrator status based only on courses completed by the end of last school year. So you don't need to worry about the courses in progress for any students at this time. We'll be following the exact same process that we did with senior validation back in the spring, and we'll provide more details in our session Wednesday morning. Just want to give you a couple of reminders there. Number 5 on our countdown, credential audits for the 2020-2021 school year will occur in late September. So as you guys are aware, due to House Bill 82 and the extension of our state collection window for student credentials earned, we were unable to conduct any of our credential audits for fall 2020 or spring 2021 until after the collection window ends. Therefore, we are planning to conduct our credential audits for both fall and spring, fall 20, spring 21, at the end of September after the data collection has ended in NCCT admin. 3 districts will be randomly selected for fall, 3 additional districts selected for spring. Should be 1 small, 1 medium, 1 large for each fall and spring. And we will notify you guys if you are selected for an audit by September 10th at the latest. And then we will certainly give you more information about what kind of documents you need to send in, what that process is going to look like. And we want you to know that our credential audits are never an I gotcha. The idea, the purpose behind the audits is to give you guys a way to review locally your processes and to give you some feedback so that we can all continue to improve our data collection and ensure that the reporting processes that we are using are consistent and accurate. We're always looking for CIMCs and directors to serve on that credential audit team. So if you are interested in that, or if you're willing to let your PPOC participate this fall, we would certainly appreciate having you guys on our team.
Miss, do you have one question? Would you like to hold that to the end? Or okay, it's will the validation be a continual yearly process, right?
It's my understanding, Chris, that yes, we will continue to do this, but it's only going to be once per year. So as we get into this school year, we will begin validating concentrators for this coming school year, 2021-2022. We'll have some tools in place to help you, some extra training to help you guys track those potential concentrators so that you're prepared to administer work keys to the appropriate students, and then you can validate those students in a timely fashion at the end of the school year. But yes, it is my understanding that that will be a continual process each year. And that's really just because we want to make sure that you guys have a chance to validate those students that are counting in the data. I'm looking at the other question. Does the credential audit take into consideration other audits taking place in a PSU? And Brett, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, so we might just come back to that question if that's okay and get some clarification. And Vicki, if you identified concentrator validation issues with seniors, we're going to talk about that in our session Wednesday morning. So I'm just going to hold off on that question until after we cover that information Wednesday morning. There is a reason why we're doing that validation for underclassmen. And so we'll cover that Wednesday. And then if we still have additional questions, we can cover those then. Okay, keep moving. So countdown number 4. Instructional coaching is booming. Hopefully it is in your local district. So we continue to try to fill our CIMC's toolboxes with strategies for implementing effective instructional coaching programs locally. I think it's been very impressive to see the growth that our CIMCs have demonstrated over the past few years as they've just embraced the concept of instructional coaching and implemented those functions within their role daily. We will continue to provide support and PD for our CIMCs as they develop and implement their coaching tactics locally. We received a tremendous amount of positive feedback around our Coaching Champions program that we implemented last year. So we will continue to provide that training for our CIMCs and regional groups. Each region has identified either one or two coaching champions who will participate in a sort of a train the trainer model, a session with constructive learning design. And that will occur somewhere between 5 and 6 times total throughout the year. And then those coaching champions will lead a micro PD session with their colleagues in their regional groups. And then just wanted to mention, as you'll hear more about throughout the week, our CTE New Teacher Induction Program includes a coaching component in which your CIMCs will be actively involved. And so each region has one coaching coordinator who will provide support and training for CIMCs to implement that coaching component of the New Teacher Induction Program locally. Robert Van Dyke has pre-recorded a session for our CIMCs to learn more about the coaching component of the New Teacher Induction Program. And so I encourage you to view that session at your convenience beginning Wednesday afternoon. That session will become available Wednesday afternoon. Okay, number 3, new CIMC induction guidelines have been released. And I'll be going through the new CIMC induction guidelines during our session Wednesday afternoon. That session will be recorded for future access if you're unable to attend live. But the new guidelines will identify clearly the eligibility requirements for adding 830 CIMC provisionally to a current educator's license, and it will also outline the requirements to either add 830 or clear the provisional license. And so we've worked really hard this summer to try to streamline the process so that nearly all the requirements of the induction program are included within that online induction course. So instead of having multiple places where you're providing artifacts to get to the end result, we're trying to pull it all into the one course. So candidates for the 830 license beginning immediately will no longer be required to submit their artifacts outside of that induction course. Everything will be included within the induction course. The only sort of exception to that is that Coaching Foundations or some other approved instructional coaching training program does continue to be a requirement for CIMC induction, and it does require a separate registration. And that's because those of you who choose to use another coaching program may choose to do that. And so we don't want you to have to go through, multiple registrations and reimbursements and things like that. So whichever coaching training program your CIMCs choose or you choose for them to do for their CIMC induction, they will be providing evidence of completing that program within their online induction course. And again, we'll talk more about those guidelines in Wednesday's session. Just wanted to give you some, just a look ahead, if you will, of some of the projects or things that we have in the works for next year. So our number 2 in the countdown is we have several projects in the works for 2021, 2022. And just to give you an idea, in the weeks and months ahead, we will be revamping both the CIMC PLC and state assessment Moodles. We considered doing it this summer, but we opted to leave the information as it is for now until the 2020-2021 school year has officially concluded. Because many of you guys are looking for resources and documents within those Moodles, and you sort of know where to find them now. So we're going to leave it as is for just a little bit longer. But in the weeks and months ahead, we're going to start doing a cleanup of the Moodles. We're going to remove some old resources that are outdated. We're going to make sure that all the new resources are there for you and organized in a way, excuse me, that are more easily accessible to you when you're looking for those quickly. Our statewide CIMC calendar of work has not been updated in quite a few years. So we plan to work with our regional groups to revise that document that is so that it's more reflective of the work that they're doing now with instructional coaching, and in data collection and reporting with a lot of the new things that have come on board in the last few years. And as we revise our calendar of work, we'll also be looking, excuse me, at revisions to the CIMC evaluation instrument. I know many of you have expressed your concern that that document is outdated and it doesn't really speak to the tasks that your CIMCs are expected to do now. So we'll be working on that, and we'll certainly keep you updated with our progress. Just wanted you to know that that work is happening. And then lastly, excuse me, we have a vision of developing resources that CIMCs can utilize in their instructional practices as they work with teachers implementing PBMs. So as you probably know, our CIMCs have really struggled with the idea of how they might support teachers that are implementing PBMs because there's really no data to track. We don't have any standards reports, there's no efficiency reports, there's really no data points that they have that they can track and use with teachers that they're accustomed to having. So our idea here is to develop a small team of CIMCs who are interested in really diving into the PBM for a particular course, and then developing some resources to use in the instructional coaching process as they're supporting their teachers. Ideally, eventually, we would have 2 to 3 head coaches, we're just calling them head coaches for now, for each course that has a PBM, and then the head coaches would train our other CIMCs on how to use those data tracking tools and what are some good instructional coaching practices that work with teachers who are implementing those PBMs. So the idea, it's in its infant stages right now. Just wanted you to know that we're kind of starting to roll with that idea, and we'll be filling our CIMCs out for interest and really working with our regional groups to determine our next steps moving forward. So just kind of wanted you to know that that was out there. And then finally, our number one thing that CTE directors need to know about curriculum instructional management this summer is that I'm always available to you for questions and support. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me by email, by phone, and let me know if you need more information. If your CIMCs need additional support, know that I'm here, willing to help with anything that you guys need. Are there any questions about the updates before we move into the next part? Brett, I'm going to get to your question in just a couple minutes. Maybe. I'm not sure if I might not be reading it right. Any other questions that we can take right now related to the updates? Okay. Well, we're going to move ahead to our feature presentation, which is the Proof of Learning Administration and Reporting Guide for CIMCs. And as many of you know, this guide has been in production for well over a year and a half, maybe even longer. But as we began considering various proofs of learning and all of the changes that have occurred in the past couple of years with data collection and reporting, we knew that we were past the point of revising our current state assessment guide. And so instead, we knew that we needed to develop a manual that would guide our CIMCs in the administration and reporting of various POLs in their local districts. And while we believe that this guide is as complete as it can be at this time, we are releasing it as a draft. And the main reason for that is because we are unsure of some of the additional reporting processes or changes in NCCT admin that are coming in the next few weeks. And so as TAPS finishes up their programming and releases some additional changes in NCCT admin, we know what projects are in the works. We're just not sure which ones are going to make it through and which ones are going to be held back for a little bit. So we just want to make sure that we're able to capture any new features in that final version of the guide. And so we're going to release it to you today as a guide, as a draft until mid-September-ish. And that also gives you guys time to let us know what we've missed and what we need to change before we provide some printed copies for you at fall conference. So a copy of this guide has been posted to the State Assessment Moodle and the Director's Moodle under the Summer Conference 2021 folder, if you want to pull a copy of that later today. So before we dive in too much, I want to go ahead and roll some credits. This team of CIMCs that you see on the screen here has provided a tremendous amount of insight, feedback, resources, blood, sweat, and tears for the development of this guide. And I just want to publicly extend my gratitude to them for the work that they have done in this guide development process, and to you for allowing them to work with us in this project. As we continue to navigate Perkins 5, The work that they have done is tremendous and will be beneficial for all throughout the state. So thank you. So if we look at just an overview of the guide, I'd like to shine a spotlight on just a few major areas that are included within the guide. I could open the guide and go through section by section with you, but that's not what either of us need this morning. But I do want to just share a few highlights. So you'll notice in the first part of the guide, we've given a lot of attention to some basic general information that really spans all of the proofs of learning. So we've defined each of those proofs of learning, and we've identified procedures for administering that particular POL type and how those student results are to be reported in NCCT admin. We've also outlined a process for state monitoring to ensure that all of our data collection and reporting processes are consistent and valid, just like we've previously developed with our credential audits. The guide includes general information for all POL types, and then the guide is broken down into 4 sections, one for each POL type. Each section of the guide for each POL type provides specific information addressing that identified POL type, and then covers information related to the assessment window, staff roles, how do you provide accommodations or information you need to keep in mind when you have students that require accommodations, reminders about handling confidential student information, collection of artifacts and accountability forms, and reporting the results in NCCT admin when applicable. Each POL section ends with a CIMC checklist for verifying that the administration of the identified POL and reporting of student results was appropriately completed. So hopefully you'll find that to be helpful. So what I wanted to do in today's session is really just kind of look at the guide through the lens of a CTE director. So I call this from the director's chair. So again, you certainly don't need me to read your movie script to you. You'll be able to read through that guide on your own. But from your perspective, I want to go through just a couple of hot topics within the guide that often come our way in the form of questions. And so we're going to see where we stand with some of those. So we're going to start with a couple questions, and I'll just have you guys respond in the chat with your response, and it'll be pretty easy. So we're going to start with the first one. The first question, when are POLs administered? So you have 5 choices here. You have choice A, within the first 5 or 10 days of the semester or year. B, within the last 5 or 10 days of the semester or year. C, within the last 30 days. D, within the enrollment term. Or E, it depends on the POL type. Y'all are certainly awake this morning and with it. Very good. So for courses with a POL that's identified as a PBM, a credential, or local, that POL is administered within the enrollment term. In most cases, the PBM is administered throughout the course, so it's really difficult to define what that administration window for a PBM would be. We know that, right? We also know that credentials are to be administered when the students have had an appropriate training and preparation for that credential assessment. So again, there's no designated administration window for that credential assessment. While it's preferred that the students have an opportunity to attempt the credential within the enrollment term, I want to make sure that you guys are clear that credential POL results may be reported at any time during or after the enrollment period up until the time that the student graduates from high school. Because local POLs are determined by the district, the administration of the identified POL is determined by the local district. So while local POL administrations are not confined to a specific window, we want our CIMCs, BLCs, and classroom administrators to be mindful and ensure that maximum instructional time is provided prior to the administration of that local POL. We don't want them administering that local POL 2 weeks prior to the end of the school year and then, waste the last 2 weeks of school. But there is some flexibility in the administration of that local POL. The only POL really that's confined to a specific testing window is the CTE state assessment. And state board policy restricts that state assessment administration to the last 5 days for a semester course and the last 10 days for a year-long course. And then likewise, our indicator POLs for students on the OCS or ECS would be bound to that same administration window when the POL is a state assessment. All right. And find my cursor. It keeps getting lost. I'm sorry for the delay. Next question. Which POL or POLs count 20% of a student's overall grade? You've got your 4 PBM choices there. I'm sorry, your 4 POL choices there, and then you have an all of the above option. Very good. Very good. You guys got it. So while many districts continue to use POL results as a final exam grade to fulfill local requirements, it is very important to note that state board policy only requires the use of a CTE state assessment to be used as a minimum of 20% of the student's overall grade. Any additional requirements that are placed on a student in terms of how their POL results are used, those are all local decisions. Okay. Let's look at some indicators. Which POLs are reported in Perkins 5 Indicator 5S1? Great. So this question is a little tricky. Yes, the best answer here is B, credential. But I want to note, and I know you guys know this, but I just want to make sure that we note that credentials are only reported in 5S1 for students who are CTE concentrators. Yes, B would be the best answer here. Okay, so we just looked at 5S1. Now let's look at 5S4. Which POLs are reported in Perkins Indicator 5S4? You guys are thinking a little bit more on this one. That's great. And this one's a little tricky too, really, because I didn't give you multiple answer options. So we do know that PBM, local, and state assessment data for courses that are in standard and LCO status are reported in 5S4. And that would be for all participants, not just CTE concentrators. That's a great review of our Perkins indicator calculations. We did include a chart in the guide that I think you'll find helpful. You'll see it here on screen. It just outlines for us each of the POL types and the course status, and then you'll be able to see how it's included in state and federal reporting. So that'll be a great way for your CIMCs to track how POL results are used in reporting. And that is included in the guide. All right, so here's another question for you. Which students are required to complete the identified POL? So eligible students is a big component of the guide. It's addressed in each section of the guide. So let's see what you guys think about that. Which students are required to complete the identified POL? Students enrolled in the course, students requiring accommodations, EL, students on the OCS, ECS. I have some more tricky options here. Students repeating a course for credit, those enrolled in credit recovery, and then third party or NCVPS online vendors. Awesome. You guys are knocking it out with the reporting side and the administration side. So there are some exceptions. So yes, H is really the best answer here. There are some exceptions, and I just wanted to highlight those. We do have this information included in the guide. This has probably been one of the more popular questions here recently about eligible students. So if we look at this chart here, you'll see a couple of exceptions that are in place for required participation in the identified POL. The first thing that I just want to note here in this chart, I have an asterisk by OCS and ECS. And that's just because we want you to be reminded to follow the current CTE guidelines for indicator POL. That document was released back in May of this year. OCS, ECS, or students who are on the OCS, ECS are not exempt from the identified POL. Rather, the guidelines that Shannon Baker and her team put out provide for us details about how the students on the occupational course of study or extended content standards will participate in that required POL. There's no exemption there. We just need to use those guidelines to lead us in how they are to participate in that POL. Students who are repeating a course for credit, state board policy outlines this for us in terms of the state assessment. So for courses that have a state assessment as the POL, it's pretty cut and dry. State board policy indicates that students may use their previous score if they made a 70 or above on that final assessment or that state assessment. Otherwise, the student would be required to retake the assessment. But when we think about courses that have a PBM or a credential POL, we might need to, kind of rethink what we're doing with those students. So if we look at a PBM, since that PBM is embedded within the course and the student is repeating that course for credit, it only makes sense that the student would be required to complete those PBM components as they're outlined in that curriculum guide. So we would expect a student who is repeating a course for credit to participate in the PBM. For courses with a credential POL, of course, it's going to depend on whether or not the student has already attempted that credential, whether or not they earned that credential, and how your local district handles retakes. And so that would certainly be handled locally if you have a student repeating a course for credit that has a credential POL. But the one we get the most questions about is students engaged in credit recovery. So if we look at students who are engaged in credit recovery, it's really up to the local district as to whether the POL must be administered. There is no state data collection for credit recovery courses because there's no PowerSchool enrollment for those CTE courses. Your local districts may use a generic course code or some type of placeholder course in PowerSchool when students are enrolled in credit recovery options throughout the school year. But in terms of a true CTE enrollment in PowerSchool, that doesn't occur with credit recovery. And so we don't really collect data on credit recovery. The only time that we would expect a student to require a student to take a POL would be if the POL is a state assessment and the student never took it the first time. So if there is no state assessment score for students who are in credit recovery and the POL is a state assessment, then we would expect you to administer that state assessment. And then there are resources in the guide to help CIMCs through enrolling them manually in NCCT admin so that they can administer that state assessment. Hopefully we've addressed several of the questions that you guys have about eligible students. All right, so here's another question, something that I learned quite a bit about in the last year. A medical exception request may be submitted for which POL types? All right, great. So most of you guys are selecting D. Can somebody just throw in the chat for me real quick? Why would you really only consider a medical exception for state assessment? Why not some of the other POL types? Excellent, Denise. That's exactly what we were looking for. So the state assessment is the only one that really has that restricted administration window. So that's really where we would expect to see medical exception requests come in. I'm not saying that you can't request a medical exception for another POL type. I just think that those are probably going to be more rare. So when we look at the medical exception process, and I have some notes here that I can put up. As we look at that medical exception request process, medical exceptions are designated for students who are unable, by definition, students who are unable to participate in the POL during the designated window. So again, the most common request that we would expect to see is for state assessment because that has a restricted administration window. However, if you look at PBM, credential, and even local POLs, you have more flexibility, some of them much more flexibility in that administration window. So we really wouldn't expect to see a ton of those. But in a rare circumstance, as I mentioned earlier, a student might not be able to participate in that particular POL within the enrollment term. If it's a POL, if it's a PBM, they might not be able to participate in that entire PBM. Maybe they become ill and you would file an exception request for them if it was a state assessment, but it's a PBM and maybe they missed their final presentation, which is a big component of their PBM. Or maybe they had an extended illness that caused them to miss several of those PBM components. Probably wouldn't expect to see many in the credential POL area unless that student had a long-term situation that would prevent them from being able to participate in that credential assessment prior to their graduation date. Again, it could be a student who is, a senior in that credential POL course, and maybe their spring senior year, and then something happens and they don't have a chance to take that credential assessment before they graduate. That would be an appropriate time to submit a medical exception request for a credential. So again, I think those situations are going to be few and far between. But I do want to remind you that in that medical exception request process, we have outlined very clearly in the guide the requirements to submit those requests, and it is imperative that those requests are complete and have adequate information for the review team to consider those requests. If the requests are incomplete, meaning the information is not provided, the accompanying documentation is not provided, then those requests will either be sent back to the district or denied, and then would require resubmission for reconsideration of that request. So we're going to be providing some pretty intense training for your CIMCs and regional groups on medical exception request process. And so be on the lookout for that for your CIMCs, and we'll make sure that we provide additional support for them in that process. I know in the past, we've looked at specific dates of when medical exception requests would be due. We're just going to kind of look at this as medical exception requests will be due by the end of the POL administration window. Sometimes things happen that we can't expect, and we're just going to be flexible with when we can receive those requests. Requests for the credential POL, like I said, may be submitted outside of that enrollment term. And if that occurs, we would just ask that you go ahead and consult with your regional coordinator prior to submitting that request, just to make sure that we've kind of covered all the bases before you submit that medical exception request. And that would be for credential POL outside of the enrollment term. Okay, which POLs undergo state monitoring or audits? I like that, Julie. I hope. So you guys must have been reading ahead in the guide, because this is new. Prior to now, we've only conducted credential audits, and those have been occurring in the last several years, aside from indicator POL audits that Shannon Baker's team conducts. But credential audits have been the only ones that we've been conducting in terms of POL administration and reporting. So this year we are implementing a state monitoring process for all POL types. And the process will be very, very similar to what we already have in place for credentials. So again, 3 districts will be selected each semester for the audit, and then they will submit documentation for credential, PBM, local, and state assessment. Don't panic. We're not going to ask you for every single class, every single administration in your district. We will let you know specifics of what we want you to send in and what that monitoring process will look like. So we'll be sharing details with directors and CIMCs who are selected for that process after the fall administration, the fall 2021 administration window closes. On this next slide, you'll see just a copy of a screenshot of one of the rubrics that's included in the guide. We have provided a copy of the rubric that will be used to monitor those POL administrations. So there's no I gotchas here. We just want to provide you with some resources to ensure that we're all administering and reporting our student data as accurately and consistently as possible. So you'll find those rubrics in the appendices of the guide. So speaking of the appendices, They actually make up more than a majority of the guide. So I think the guide itself is about maybe 46 to 48 pages. And then the appendices carry out the rest of the guide. So we have many additional resources that have been included in the guide this year to help CIMCs perform the tasks, the duties that they need to administer those different POL types within their districts. We've expanded some of the information, as I mentioned before, about the medical exception process. You'll see those state monitoring rubrics. You'll see updated accountability forms, new accountability forms so that each POL type has an accountability form. And then you'll see a list of state board policy references. So all the information that I've covered with you today is in the guide, plus way, way more. Lots of extra resources available in that appendices section of the guide. So I encourage you to look through that and use that information as needed. So if we really start thinking about this guide as a whole, and I know when you guys pull down a copy of it and really start going through it and looking through it, you'll notice that the guide really is designed for CIMCs. And that was its intent. We knew that our CIMCs needed that tool to be able to administer and report POLs the way that they needed to, according to our, our expectations and our best practices. And so when you think about that guide and how you might use that in your districts to train your teachers, I have one more question for you. And that question is, do you think that a teacher guide version would be beneficial? Do you think that it would be helpful to have an additional guide that's designed, it's really just pared down for teachers? Or do you think that it's too much to keep up with two different guides? Do you think it would be too much for your CIMCs to have two different guides, one for them, one for their teachers? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of yeses. So that's what we'll do in the next couple of weeks is we'll just take this guide and we'll pare it down to only include the information that would be applicable to teachers so that your CIMCs will have an additional resource to use in training. It'll save you a lot of paper if you guys print your assessment manuals locally for your teachers, and will certainly cut down on some of that extra information that's out there that teachers don't really need to have to sort through. So that's great. I appreciate your feedback on that. Well, I think that I have covered all of the things that I had planned to cover with you guys in terms of the guide. Again, here is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time with questions or comments, concerns. Be happy to help in any way that I possibly can. I do appreciate your feedback during this session. And one last thing that I would ask you to do, if you don't mind, at the end of this session, would be to access the session survey. And you'll find that in the main menu of your Eventry platform. You'll see an icon there for session survey, and then you'll just click on the link for the summer conference session survey, and then that just pops you out to a new window, and it's just a short little survey for today's session. So if you don't mind taking care of that before you move on to the next session, we will certainly appreciate that. And I think we have a few minutes to take any questions if you have any. Okay, Beth, great question. The CIMC technical guide has been retired. So the information that was included in that technical guide has now been embedded within this new guide. So as you go through the new guide, if you find that there's something that you used to reference in the old technical policies and procedures guide that's not in the guide, please let me know. But we are very careful to go through all of the components of that old technical policies and procedures guide, and we implemented those in this new guide, mainly in the appendices section, but you should find all that information in this new guide. Well, thank you all again for joining me this morning, and I hope that you have a great conference, and I will see you in many of the sessions and look forward to collaborating with you throughout the week. Thank you.